He was the second most powerful man in the Reich, the Führer's shadow, Hitler's most powerful general. He was Field Marshal Hermann Göring. Documentaries might tell you he was a drug addict, a lover of luxury, and an overweight man. But in this video, we'll learn the true story of Hermann Göring. In Nuremberg, the second most powerful man in the Nazi regime is currently on trial. He pleaded not guilty, but was ultimately sentenced to death. First, however, we must look back at his early life. Göring was born on January 12, 1893, in the village of Marienbad in Rosenheim. His father was a cavalry officer, and his mother, Franziska, came from a poor farming family. Göring had 4 brothers. He spent part of his childhood at Felselsberg Castle, owned by his mother's lover, the Jewish physician Hermann von Eppenstein. It was there that the young Göring's character began to take shape. At the age of 11, he entered a rigorous military boarding school known for its strictness and discipline, the Karlsruhe Military Academy. There, he learned various skills, including hunting, mountaineering, and military discipline. At 16, he entered the Berlin Military Academy, graduating with honors. He then joined the infantry as a lieutenant. In 1914, World War I broke out, and his regiment was fighting on the Western Front. When he was wounded during the war, he suffered from arthritis in his knee and remained hospitalized for several months. He was discharged from the army as he was no longer physically fit, but his friend Bruno Lorzer helped him become a ground observer for aircraft. He then received the necessary training to become a pilot, but he hadn't been piloting for long when he was injured in a crash. He spent most of 1916 recovering from his injuries. After the death of the Red Baron, the most famous pilot of World War I, Göring became commander of the JG-1 squadron. Göring achieved more than 22 victories and was awarded the Iron Cross for his courage and skill. However, his dreams were shattered after Germany's defeat in 1918. Like many other military personnel, he believed that the political leadership was responsible for Germany's defeat. After the humiliating Treaty of Versailles, most German army officers were dismissed, the number of soldiers was reduced, and the Luftwaffe was dissolved. Göring was devastated, but he insisted on flying. He worked for the Dutch company Fokker. It was during his employment that he met his first wife, Karin von Kantzow, who was married to a Swedish officer and belonged to a noble family. She separated from her husband and left her children to marry Göring, and in 1922 the lovers were married. In early 1922, Göring attended a speech by a young man who delivered his speeches in Munich's beer halls. Impressed by the young man's personality and speech, Göring decided to join his party. This young man was Adolf Hitler, the official spokesman of the Nazi Party. This was the first time the two men had met. Upon joining the Nazi Party, Göring also joined the SA Stormtroopers, the party's armed wing, led by Ernst Röhm. Göring was able to raise the group's military capabilities, transforming it from a band of thugs into a semi-regular army. With the help of his wife, Karin, Göring also cultivated excellent relationships with high-ranking officers in the German army. On the night of November 8, 1923, Hitler led a coup against the authorities in Munich, aided by the SA and some prominent figures who sympathized with the Nazi Party, such as General Ludendorff, the most famous German general of World War I. Hitler distrusted the security forces and underestimated the authority of the government. But what happened next was unexpected. The police opened fire on his men, and Hitler was wounded. He was shot in the shoulder and nearly killed, but his bodyguard intervened. Göring was wounded in the thigh and managed to escape from Germany. Hitler was captured at a country house on the Austrian-German border. Göring was treated with doses of morphine, to which he later became addicted. He traveled with his wife to Venice to meet the fascist leader Mussolini, who admired Hitler and his party, and sought support from the Dutch. However, Mussolini was unwilling to help a man representing a party whose power had been curtailed. A year later, he traveled to Sweden, his wife's homeland, where he became addicted to morphine and was subsequently transferred to a psychiatric hospital. Göring was now nothing. In 1924, Hitler was released after serving about 9 months in Landsberg prison, where he wrote his famous book, Mein Kampf. After his release, he decided to seize power through democratic means. In 1927, Göring returned to Germany. During his meeting with Hitler, he told him he had lost everything, and reminded him of what he had done for him. Göring was involved in violence again, but he chose the path of democracy alongside Hitler. He became a Nazi Party representative in the Reichstag in 1928, and in 1932, he became president of the Reichstag after the Nazi Party won a majority of seats. In 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Once Hitler came to power, Göring assumed numerous important positions, which caused jealousy among Hitler's inner circle. However, Göring was resolute. He established the Gestapo and later became Minister of Economics, Deputy Führer in the party, and Commander of the Luftwaffe. On February 27, 1933, Göring set fire to the Reichstag and blamed it on the Communists, using it as a pretext to eliminate them. Dachau camp awaited them. The SA's demands for a share of power increased, and the army commanders were dissatisfied with this unit, which was essentially composed of thugs. Hitler's most pressing concern was war, and he didn't want to lose the support of the army generals. Therefore, Himmler and Göring advised him to eliminate the SA. On June 30, 1934, the SA commanders were summoned to a meeting at a hotel in Bad VC, where they were all arrested. Hitler personally arrested Ernst Röhm. The following day, the SA commanders were liquidated in cold blood. On July 1, 1934, Röhm was assassinated in his cell. Now, Himmler's infamous SS was unrivaled. From the moment Hitler seized power in Germany, he began preparing for war to avenge the defeat of 1918. His main reliance was on the Air Force, commanded by Field Marshal Göring. According to the Treaty of Versailles, German arms factories were closed, but secretly, aircraft were being developed. Modern submarines were being built in German steel mills. Hitler was planning to launch the war as soon as possible. Before assuming power, he consistently attacked the Treaty of Versailles in his speeches. Therefore, on March 7, 1936, he sent his troops into the Rhineland, a restricted area according to the Treaty of Versailles. France and England did not react. On March 18, 1938, Austria was annexed by Germany, and German troops entered Austria with little resistance. There, Göring met his sisters, Olfa and Paula, who married Austrian lawyers. Hitler visited his elementary school, and this film shows him inside the school among the students and teachers. This film was shot by his mistress, Eva Braun. Czechoslovakia was the next target for the Führer, but Göring feared entering into open warfare. On September 29, 1938, Hitler invited the leaders of 3 European countries to Munich: Mussolini, the leader of Italy; Daladier, the Prime Minister of France. The French right-wing ministers and British Prime Minister Chamberlain agreed to give the Sudetenland to Hitler. Strangely, Czechoslovakia, from which part of its territory was annexed, had no representative at the Munich conference. Hitler's confidence grew, but Göring remained concerned. He desired continued peace, but despite his influence, he could not oppose the Führer. Although Göring feared open warfare, he assured Hitler of the Air Force's readiness. By 1939, Göring had 4,000 fighter planes, but the problem lay in the shortage of necessary resources for flying, such as bombs and fuel. In 1936, the Spanish Civil War broke out. Hitler supported Franco, and this was the perfect opportunity to promote the Reich's weapons. The Condor Corps was sent to aid the Spanish dictator, and the Luftwaffe participated in the bombing of Guernica. In 1937, the Luftwaffe astonished the world in that war. Göring now seems proud of his work. Franco won the war, and upon the Condor Corps returned to Germany, they were honored. On September 1, 1939, the Führer decided to invade Poland. Despite Marshal Göring's attempts to reach a settlement, the Nazi leader was determined to wage war. The Germans relied on blitzkrieg, intensively bombing Polish cities, the capital Warsaw, and infrastructure. The Luftwaffe destroyed everything with air support. There was a rapid assault with modern tanks, vehicles, and horses. Despite warnings from France and Britain, the aggression continued, and within weeks, Poland fell. However, Hitler did not want a confrontation with the Soviets at that time, so he sent his foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, went to Moscow, and a non-aggression pact was signed between the two sides on August 23, 1939. After the Germans captured Warsaw, Stalin invaded the rest of Poland. Despite successive victories, what Göring feared came to pass: open war. But this was of no consequence to Hitler. He was infallible. In the summer of 1940, the Nazis succeeded in occupying France. Hitler accomplished in a matter of weeks what the Germans had failed to do in 4 years of World War I. Göring's fears were irrelevant now. What mattered was victory. But Göring was now tasting the bitterness of defeat. Despite the great victory, the Battle of France had exposed the Luftwaffe's weaknesses. At Dunkirk, there were more than 300,000 British, French, and Belgian troops trapped on the coast. If these forces had been destroyed, it would have been a devastating blow to the Allies. Göring had asserted that the Air Force was capable of crushing them, but Churchill ordered every ship to head ashore and take on as many as it could. A large number of men were rescued, but some say this was a merciful gesture from Hitler, as he wanted to reach an agreement with Churchill. However, Göring's greatest failure came in the Battle of Britain. After the British refused to cooperate with Hitler, he decided to bomb British cities, especially London, and destroy the Royal Air Force to force Britain to surrender or negotiate. Field Marshal Göring once again demonstrated his ability to destroy the Royal Air Force, but the losses were heavy. The British managed to destroy many German aircraft, forcing Hitler to postpone the invasion of England. It now seems that Göring was right. The German army's resources were dwindling, and to continue the war, Hitler needed more resources. Therefore, on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa was launched to invade the Soviet Union, the largest invasion in history. The Germans managed to seize vast parts of the Soviet Union. Hitler expected the Soviet Union to fall before winter. There, Göring's name became associated with war crimes. In every European country the Nazis entered, the suffering of the Jews increased, as they were deported to concentration camps, or forced to be held in cramped, impoverished ghettos. Jewish property was looted. Göring was careful to keep his name away from this, despite being the Führer's shadow. However,
Und so geht denn in die Weihnacht hinein mit der ganzen Freude, wie sie nur Kinder haben können.
The Russians launched a strong counterattack that forced the Germans to retreat, and the attack on Moscow failed. On February 2, 1943, the German Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad. This was a resounding failure for Göring, who had asserted that he could deliver supplies and support to the besieged German army at Stalingrad, but the Luftwaffe was unable to provide assistance. Hitler was furious and dismissed a number of generals, but Göring had been right. The army exhausted its resources. Even industrial fuel became scarce, especially with the Royal Air Force's attacks on German cities and infrastructure. British aircraft were able to evade German defenses and mercilessly bomb German cities. The Americans joined the British, and Allied aircraft bombed German cities day and night without pause. The Germans were unable to repel the enemy raids from the ground and the air. Before the Allied landings in Normandy, the Allies bombed German factories, infrastructure, and main roads. Field Marshal Göring was always making empty promises that he never kept. Adolf Galland was a legendary pilot. He had fought in numerous air battles and won 109. Now, Göring was relying on him to save the situation. The Great Catastrophe, which marked the beginning of the end, occurred when the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944. 130,000 men crossed the English Channel towards the French coast. It was a disastrous day. The Germans lost hundreds of aircraft, 244 German pilots were killed, and the Allies gained complete air superiority. The German Luftwaffe appeared to be finished, and without air cover, all German counterattacks failed. Hitler was engaged in heated arguments with his generals, and his relationship with Göring had reached its lowest point. On August 25, 1944, the Allies liberated Paris, but the suffering did not end there. The Allies launched a massive aerial bombardment of German cities, resulting in tens of thousands of civilian casualties and the destruction of entire cities. On February 13, 1945, the Allies launched extensive airstrikes on Dresden for 3 consecutive days. The Allied raids continued day and night until the city was completely destroyed. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed. Many believed the objective was simply revenge. Churchill said, "Let the Germans taste some of the suffering they have inflicted on the world." On October 16, 1945, the major Soviet offensive on Berlin began, and the battle became a street war between German and Soviet forces. On April 25th, Berlin was completely encircled. On April 30th, 1945, the Führer committed suicide with his mistress, Eva Braun. On May 2nd, the German army surrendered. But where did Göring go? He fled to Oberthusburg in southern Germany. From there, Göring sent a message to Hitler that he should assume command of the Reich as the Führer's deputy. Hitler considered this treason and ordered Göring's arrest, stripping him of all his positions. After the Führer's suicide, Göring voluntarily surrendered to the Americans on May 9, 1945. He believed he was in a position to negotiate and refused to acknowledge that he had lost everything. He was brought to trial at Nuremberg along with the remaining Nazi leaders. He attempted to exonerate himself from the crimes of genocide, and claimed the existence of buried Reich treasures to avoid the death penalty. For many years, the Nazis had invaded numerous countries, amassing vast treasures and wealth. They looted rare artifacts and priceless works of art. It is believed that some of these treasures are buried beneath Göring's headquarters in Hall, which Hitler financed and renovated in the 1930s to serve as the Führer's deputy headquarters in the North Rhine-Westphalia. While Hitler fled to his Alpine hideout in Berghof, Marshal Göring did the same in Hall. His evasive tactics were unsuccessful, and he was ultimately sentenced to death by hanging on October 1, 1946. However, Göring had preferred to be executed by firing squad, but the court refused and insisted on execution by hanging. Göring wished to die like a medieval knight, as a man who had truly been a leader of the Wehrmacht. Unlike most of Hitler's men, Göring refused suicide and preferred to stand trial. However, he always carried 3 capsules of cyanide, one of which he took with him everywhere, even into the courtroom. So, before his scheduled execution on October 16, 1946, he took a dose of cyanide and died as a result. Now, the second man is nothing. After the end of the war, everything related to Nazism was erased. Berlin was divided between the Soviets and the Allies. The German nation lived through bitter days. Even now, everything related to Nazism is considered taboo. The Nazi years are a black box that can never be opened again. Perhaps now Germany is free and breathes clean air.